Welcome back, COS supporters, to another edition of COS Live. My name is Andrew Luce. I'll be your host. And of course, I am joined by Rita Peters, who is my co-host, but she's also the Senior VP of Legislative Affairs. Rita, it is great to be back with you. And happy belated birthday to you, by the way. I hope it was really blessed.
Well, Andrew, happy belated birthday to you. As our viewers might not know, Andrew and I happen to be birthday twins. So yes, we share the same birthday, April 29th. Thanks, Andrew. I had a great birthday. I hope you did as well. And I'm excited to cover this committee hearing today.
Yeah, so we're going to be going over to Ohio today. The House Government Oversight Committee considered our Convention of States Resolution HJR 2, but there is a little catch. The hearing happened back in March, and it was actually March 25th when this happened. We didn't end up live streaming it because we didn't think it was going to be super lively. Ended up being a really great hearing with some great golden nuggets. So we're going to be covering that today. We'll watch the recording and then we'll offer some commentary after. Ohio is still very active right now. There's still a lot going on. We're still waiting another hearing. So can you get our viewers caught up with what's going on and what they can expect to see in this recording today?
Absolutely. Well, earlier in the year, we did bring you coverage of action from the Senate side in Ohio. They held first the sponsors introduction hearing. Not a lot of action there. But then the second hearing was the proponent only hearing on SJR 3, the companion resolution to HJR 2, the one that will be heard in the hearing we're broadcasting today. So this hearing that we're about to watch was on the House side of the Ohio legislature. They like to hold a lot of hearings in Ohio. And so this was the first one. The way they always start is by having a first committee hearing where the sponsors introduce the resolution, explain to the committee members what it's all about, why they're offering it, and then answer questions just from the committee members. So a lot of times this sponsors introduction hearing just sort of goes off without a lot of fanfare, without a lot of discussion or debate, and is pretty straightforward. But as Andrew said, this one had a lot of great, really meaty questions and answers. So that's why we want to bring you the recording of that today. Now, you'll see our champions there in the Ohio House, Representative Bernard Willis, as well as Majority Whip Riordan McLean. Those are our two primary sponsors in the Ohio House. They will introduce the COS resolution and explain what it's all about. I want to also just give you a little bit of background information on Ohio's progress. More than 117,000 Ohioans have signed the Convention of States petition, specifically asking their state legislators to vote yes for COS. According to a study by the Trafalgar Group, almost 2/3 of Ohio voters, 62%, favor the state calling an Article 5 convention to propose constitutional amendments that will limit federal spending, federal power, and establish term limits for members of Congress and other federal officials. This support crosses party lines, with 71% of Republicans, 50% of Democrats, and 66% of those with other political affiliations supporting a convention. So there's huge support for this in Ohio, Andrew.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rita, let's get right to it. Let's watch the recording and then we'll come back and we'll offer a little bit of commentary. So, Producer G, please roll that tape.
We're going to first call up House Joint Resolution 2 with Representative McLean, Representative Willis. Welcome to committee. Proceed when ready.
Thank you, Chairman. Chair Hall, Vice Chair Ferguson, he was here, I'm not sure where he'll be back, I'm sure. Ranking Member Humphrey and members of the committee, it's my honor to be here with you again this morning to provide sponsor testimony on House Joint Resolution 2. This resolution issues a call for a convention of states under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution to propose amendments regarding limited subjects. I've come to this position reluctantly with research, deliberation, and prayer. It's not the first time that we've been here. We've had this resolution in the last 2 General Assemblies, and it's my hope that we can get this accomplished this time around. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution lays out 2 specific paths for amendments. The first is by Congress itself proposing amendments, and the second is why we're here today, for the states to call a convention. Both paths require ratification of any amendments by the states. So per Article 5, the convention process is laid out as 2/3 of the states, which is 34 in total, must pass a resolution such as the one before you today regarding this similar subject matter. Once 34 states have done so, Congress is instructed to call a convention in which each state would send delegates to attend. At the convention, deliberation, proposing amendments would happen, and voting on those amendments of the delegation would send any agreed upon amendments, again, like I said, back to the states for ratification. And that ratification process is high. 3/4 of the states, 38 states in total, have to agree before any amendment is added to our Constitution. This process is very difficult and by nature cannot be partisan. To amend the U.S. Constitution, it requires broad support. So House Joint Resolution 2 calls amending convention limited to the subject matters that I'm going to go through right now. We have 3. The first is to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, passing a balanced budget amendment. We have no control over the printing and spending of the federal government as the state of Ohio. We need some constitutional limitations on Congress in this manner. And this is not a new issue. This has been going on for years and years, back to the 80s, when then President Reagan was pushing for a convention on this matter. Number 2, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. This is a broad scope, and this would regard to a lot of the overreach and interpretations of the Supreme Court, which I'll talk to in a moment here, but this will be really giving more of the intended federalism system that we have where Ohio can make decisions for Ohioans. And the third is limiting the terms of office for its officials and members of Congress of the United States. So this would be a term limits amendment, proposing amendments in that vein. We're not specifying a specific path, a number of years. We want the conversation to move forward. So those are the 3 subject matters that would be germane to this convention. Our founders, specifically George Mason in that process, wanted this provision included in case of emergency as the state's position of last legal resort regarding federal abuse. It is there in case the federal government would become too expansive, too intrusive, and too unaccountable to the states. In 2025, it's not hard to see that our federal government has become too expansive, too intrusive, and too unaccountable to the states. Our current experience as Americans has become to live in presidential cycles. As much of federal policy is accomplished through executive action, and the state's role has become diminished. These policies, as we've seen, can be reversed just as easily as they were signed. Congress has abdicated nearly all of its authority to federal bureaucracies. It allows our military to be used without declaring war and recklessly prints and spends citizens' taxes to the point where we're now $36 trillion in debt, and the interest payments on those are quickly becoming the biggest budget line item. The Supreme Court has changed those interpretations of our constitutions in favor of an ever-expanding role of government through the General Welfare Clause and the Interstate Commerce Clause, just to name 2. All of this unconstitutional abuse can be corrected through a state's convention. It is my hope that this committee will give this the proper attention and serious consideration that it deserves. It is time to force Congress to act in this regard, and if they won't, we must. I want to thank my joint sponsor, Rep. Willis, for standing with me on this mission, and I now turn to him.
Thank you, Rep. McLean. Chairman Thomas, Vice Chair Ferguson, Ranking Member Humphrey, members of the committee, I'd like to thank you again for allowing us to speak on House Joint Resolution 2, which I believe is an imperative resolution urging Congress to call for that convention of states or a constitutional convention under Article 5 of our own U.S. Constitution. Standing here as a member who served over 30 years, having sworn allegiance to the United States Constitution, I can tell you that it is broken in a few different ways that the government has facilitated. This would allow us to focus on three main issues that will facilitate the conversation in our own state, and it will also, first and foremost, support a balanced budget. It will limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government and finally establish the necessary term limits that I believe that we need for federal legislators. If passed in Ohio, the resolution encourages more states around the country to join an effort in reining the federal government and offering more power of that back to the states. I sponsored House Joint Resolution 2 as I found it baffling how our elected officials at the U.S. level have for decades been incapable of balancing a budget that over time has progressively gotten worse. This accountability is important when it comes to decisions made about budgets and spending, as our citizens and taxpayers are directly impacted on a state and local monetary level. And those poor decisions and government overreach and regulations can stunt and even cripple business growth and economic development for our state and our nation. As elected officials in our state, it's our responsibility to take this initiative into our own hands if the federal government refuses to do so on their own terms. Next, the resolution is a tool for our state to urge Congress to introduce amendments for term limits to the Constitution. The democratic system of government was established to promote freedom through election by its citizens. And as time progresses, we see history repeating itself with more of the same federal officials in office. And the current system has established career politicians whose greed has been on display for over the past several years, certainly. And I believe that we need to limit the power of large overreaching government and break up the ties of elected officials to the legislative branch and its stakeholders through term limits. Representative McClain and I found it necessary to expand the concept further through House Joint Resolution 2, promoting the conversations in Ohio about limiting power and restricting jurisdiction, creating fiscal boundaries, and establishing term limits. As the founding fathers of our country created this path for the states to reclaim their power in anticipation of this kind of overreach. This was implemented for the purpose of reining in the federal government. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution provides the states, us, the power to call a convention of states or a constitutional convention to propose such amendments so that we can retain our power in our states. This resolution joins Ohio with numerous additional states, as my colleagues already mentioned, and nearly 20 of them are attempting to manage the federal government's control in the same way. I want to thank Representative McClain deeply for his leadership, continuing leadership in sponsoring the resolution and spearheading what is now a nationwide campaign in our own great state for the last several years. Thank you for your consideration for House Joint Resolution 2, and we're happy to attempt to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you both for your response to testimony this morning. Any questions from members of the Representative Gross?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. Representative McClain, in your testimony, you named three things. You said that you would impose fiscal constraints, limit the power and the jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for the officials. How could the convention then, in your knowledge, change the stated goals once they got there? Do you know? Yes or no?
Thank you, Representative Gross, through the chair. The answer would be no. So the convention would be called on specific subject matter terms. The convention is called. Anything that's not pertaining to what we've outlined here, just like in any other rules of order, like we have in the body here, subjects that are not germane to the topic would simply, an objection would be raised if something was outside of those bounds and could be dealt with within the leadership of the convention.
Follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So what historical precedent exists to justify your answer that an Article 5 could not be changed once delegates got to D.C.? Pursuant to Article 5, where in Article 5 does it state that you would be limited to these three things?
Sure. Thank you, Representative Gross, through the chair. So there is a legal debate on Article 5. There's no doubt about that. There are legal scholars on both sides of the issue. We've never called an Article 5 under the parameters of what we're talking about today in an amending Constitution. So there certainly will be legal, and we will hope to have legal experts come in to provide that testimony. I'm sure both sides, both supporting this argument and opposing this argument, would be willing to come in and testify. I've spent a lot of time on this issue, but I, however, would not consider myself a constitutional scholar on this topic, devoted my life to it. I believe in the path, and we would love to have those people in there. There are many historical precedents for conventions of varying levels, whether that be state level, whether that be a group of others. So there certainly is precedent within our system of government to lay this out. But we would love to answer many of the questions you have regarding how exactly this would play out.
So, thank you, Chair. So, since you mentioned historical precedent, what historical precedent has been set prior to an Article 5 that you can talk about?
We can get, through the chair, we can get you the list of all of the, under Article 5, there is no specific precedent for this. We had, obviously, when the only other time the Article 5 or the only other convention, constitutional convention that happened, the creation of our U.S. Constitution was created, right? So the Articles of Confederation were turned into the document that we're talking about here today. So the parameters from this document, there is no identical precedent for what we're doing today. There many attempts have been made. Like I said, most notably back in the 80s, and there are a number of other calls that are out there today. In my argument on sort of the subject matter parameters, one of the largest components to that is well over 32 states have issued a Convention of States call through the years. We are well over 32 on a wide variety of subject topics. So if subject matter didn't matter, we have the call today. We could call a convention where everything is sort of on the table. That's not what we're asking for. We're asking for specific parameters on these specific provisions, which there are, and we can get the list of all of the conventions that have gone on through the years. I'm not going to rattle off those today, but we can get the list of all of the others under Article 5. This will be new, and we do need to make sure that the process proceeds as we want it to, or as it is intended to.
Thank you, Representative Gross. Any information you can provide, if you want to share it with our office, we can distribute to the committee. Representative Rader.
Thank you, gentlemen, for presenting this here today. So you mentioned early on that there's another process laid out in Article 5 that to amend the Constitution. That's through Congress, and doing the amendment process. That's been used 27 times. Last time it was used in the 90s, right, when Congress imposed rules on itself to limit when they could give themselves pay raises. So why not approach that process, something that we have clear precedent to use and pressure our Congress members? And ostensibly, this is coming from states that obviously, it's coming from states that are Republican-controlled. We have a completely Republican-controlled Congress, federal government. You know, there is certainly will from the Republican Party to, enact term limits and do the things like gut our federal government that's happening at the federal level right now. So why not use that process, again, that's tried and true, that we fully understand works, to go about this instead of potentially opening up, I think, what Representative Gross might have been getting at is a runaway convention.
I guess I would hazard the guess also that all of the questions that are actually being asked for in this particular resolution have been asked of our Congress, and it has been reticent to act. And so one of the things that we've been asking for a good amount of time is where does the state's power actually live for making these kind of changes that are substantial, that are ones that the federal government, by its very nature, would say, we're probably not going to do that. Whether it is looking at it as a purely representative government and saying, well, you are the representatives of the state, realizing that then, again, we have to get a majority and all of those things have to pass. This is one of the ways, and we would have to go back all the way to the beginning of this and say, when the Constitution was put together, Article 5 was placed there for a very substantial reason. The fact that it has not been exercised in this way yet, I think, is immaterial. The fact is, the states have that power. We have plenty of concerns on both sides. I think you will hear massive proponent testimony on the reasons why this makes sense to go about it in the way that we're asking to do it now. There has been a substantial amount of background work done to ensure and to test the process to make sure that we understand how should this go. Let's actually bring delegates together in a mock kind of convention process and see what would this look like? How would we make this work? And to have the legal people on the other side saying, what if this happens? And play devil's advocate with it. I would also say that, I think you said it well, this is a completely non-partisan issue. To me, this is an American issue that happens to come before us as Ohioans to say, we're Ohio, we're going to take back the power that is granted to us by the U.S. Constitution and say, these are things that are of high concern for us, and we want the federal government to do something. The last part that I would say to that is, the most recent time that in my lifetime we have seen a significant number of states come forward for a call was, as stated by Representative McClain, in the 80s. And in the 80s is when we saw, because we had such a large number of states that were asking to actually bring these things to a convention, the federal government acted. And so I've said before, I am a bit agnostic to whether we have an actual convention, but what I do believe is by asking for a convention, we put significant pressure on our federal government to begin to act in the way that we would like for it to act. And so it's entirely possible that we never get the number of states that we want to actually have a convention. But what I believe is the closer you get to that, the more closely the federal government is going to begin to act the way that we're asking them to act.
Can I ask one follow-up just real
Absolutely.
quick? And thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Thank you. So, you know, it's not unforeseeable that we could get to, especially in these political times when people really want change and things, that we could get to a convention. So I have to imagine that, and let's say that we even do keep it from becoming a runaway convention, and we do stay focused on what you're trying to do here, which is limit the jurisdiction and the power of the federal government. What assurances, unless it's your goal, but what assurances do you have that we're going to be able to protect things if Ohio has one vote in this whole situation? You have 50 states, Ohio has one vote. How do we protect things like Social Security and Medicare that people that I know, that I represent, rely on? And I'm afraid, I'm genuinely afraid when I see cuts to federal government, those entitlement programs are going to be the target. And we're hearing this at the federal level too. You know, Elon Musk calling these programs Ponzi schemes, right? How do we ensure that these essential programs are actually going to be protected if this convention were to take place?
I guess built into the process, it does require realizing that even if we get to 2/3 of the states that agree, and then Congress goes through the steps to actually have the convention, the things that come out of that convention have to then be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And so I want to be very clear about that. Even if this process happens and it actually has outcomes and it has constitutional amendments, all of those amendments have to be ratified by 75% of the states. I would think that that is a high enough bar to realize that our democracy, our republic, and our process is actually going to hold true in that.
Thank you, Representative Rader. Representative King?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. I know this topic has been around for nearly a decade, and I am not very familiar. I'll just be real honest, and I know there are several groups, I think, advocating for the same thing. So can you explain just kind of how it works, the appointment of delegates, their reimbursement, and how that would work as far as who will be representing Ohio?
Thank you, Representative King. Through the chair, we've got a bill for you. So the next bill that we're going to be talking about is in response to some of those questions that you have. That's not laid out specifically in Article 5. Article 5 sets the parameters. We want Ohio to have a plan beforehand. We've heard that from other members, and so we've developed a plan for that, and we'll be happy to get into that at that time.
Follow-up, Chair?
Yep.
Thank you. So how are we assured that, and I think other members had already asked the question that was on my mind and talk about the runaway convention. I know that term, I've heard that term before, but you know, the Constitution's only as strong as the will of the people. And how are we going to be assured that these delegates, or I guess they are delegates, are going to do the will of the people, that they're not going to, I guess, circumvent or maybe bring up another topic? How do we have a surety that that's not going to happen?
I would reiterate my joint sponsors for the first statement that what we believe is each state is actually going to have to set up that construct to ensure that those that they appoint to be the delegates for the state are held to a legal standard, so that if they do walk out from whatever committee is set up to have those people go forward as the representatives of Ohio, that if they're stepping outside those bounds, they are felons. Right? Those are things that we cannot have, someone who's representing us and then taking something outside the will of our voters and our representatives for those voters. I think we're going to have that covered again, and we're going to give you another bill here in just a second to talk about that.
Thank you, Representative King. Representative Stevens?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you all for coming in today. I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to term limits. I know that you said to discuss it. I think, we've had term limits here in Ohio since the 90s, and I was counting. I think we have 33 freshman members. I personally agree with term limits, but I also personally believe that 8 years is too short. I've served 3 different positions, and in each one of them, as elected positions, about year 6, you remember the phone numbers, you know who to call, you know where the bathrooms are and that sort of thing. Is there, and maybe this is a better question for the next bill that's online, but is there a range of term limits or the amount of years for congressional seats, I guess, in U.S. Senate that you're aiming for?
Sure. Thank you. Through the chair, Representative Stevens, that's a great question. So there is no, every state would develop sort of what their idea would be on term limits. I think there are a lot of differing opinions out there, and as a member who's now in my 4th term, I can agree with you that 8 years seems pretty short in terms of understanding legislation and being effective. And so all sort of options are on the table. And I will note that the argument can be made about elected officials, congressional members, Senate members. They are accountable to the voters periodically, whether that be 2 years or 6 years in Congress. The component of this, this is not limited to just those. This is limited to sort of any federal bureaucracy, and we see people go to government and work for a lifetime, never leave. And so some of those instances, we could put parameters on, say, you cannot go to Washington, D.C., accumulate wealth through your positions and stay there. So not only for elected positions, but non-elected positions within our federal government too, would be open for conversations. I think that, to that kind of 8-year point, I do agree that's pretty short. And there are proposals out there for 8 years, or a specific set of years per chamber, and then, or maybe sort of a lifetime cap. There's a lot of options on the table. We're in this prescribing no specific thing. Ohio, through the process could determine, the legislature would determine sort of and we'll get into that in the other bill, the legislature can determine the plan that their delegates are supposed to enact or supposed to advocate for collectively as a legislature, and then the delegates would be held accountable to making that case at the convention.
Okay, thank you.
Follow. Thank you, Representative Stevens. Representative Lear.
Thank you, Chair Hall. Good morning, gentlemen. My question is about imposing fiscal restraints. Absolutely, we need to. We're watching DOGE expose all kinds of fraud, people getting Social Security 150 to 300 plus years old. It's ridiculous what our government has been doing without our knowledge. But my question is, has there been any conversation in the mock conventions or anywhere else about getting our fiscal house in order before we have a balanced budget amendment? Because I don't want to balance the budget they have right now in Washington. I want to see it demonstrably smaller before we consider putting the kind of restraints on that Ohio has.
Thank you, Representative, through the chair. I would agree with you. So the short answer would be, as part of this process, we would set the terms of what that balanced budget amendment would be, set the parameters of where in line that federal spending should be. I mean, I think this is not prescriptive to what that plan is. And I would assume that at a convention, there could be some proposals made of, we have to keep our budget within certain parameters of GDP or tying it to some sort of metric, in addition to being a balanced budget. So short answer to your question is yes, I agree with you in terms of that consideration, but we're not prescriptive on how that happens. This is simply calling a convention, having a debate on that topic, ways that we can, to your goal and to my goal, to make sure our federal government is efficient. And a lot of what is going on in DC right now is sort of a review of that. In order to make some of those changes, hopefully that they're able to make lasting, I believe we're going to have to go down this path. We're going to have a convention, either having a convention or forcing Congress to officially enact the measures that the executive branch is enacting.
Paul. Thank you, Representative Weir. Ranking Member Humphrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, representatives, for being here today. I have two questions, if that's okay, Mr. Chairman. The first question I have is I just want to know what examples of what are some examples of federal overreach that Ohio HJR 2 aims to address? Like, what are some examples of overreach?
Are you talking just about the jurisdiction side, or are we talking about monetary also?
Let's start with jurisdiction, please.
Well, I think we've seen places in the jurisdictional space where we have had to look at legislation inside Ohio to be cautious for our constituents and our voters, to ensure that the federal government is not overreaching their mandates. And I go back to again and say, as Ohio, this is one of those places where we get the opportunity, and I believe that Article 5 is specifically in the Constitution for this reason. It is so that any state, a state, can say, we are going to start the call because we have a valid concern against the federal government that is doing whatever these things are. And they can bring that forward, because realize that this call has almost 20 states on it already. But that started with one. And it started with the one because they said, we have valid concerns against our federal government. There are many different places, I think, where you would look at overreach in different spaces. The main one that I'm most concerned with is our actual debt. Realizing that each and every one of us we could actually pay the debt for United States government today if we all wrote a check for over $100,000 apiece. Each and every American, right, in six figures today, because, again, our federal government in many ways has done exactly these things. They have overreached in areas to spend dollars that we did not have while borrowing those against our children's future. This is one of those places where the states get to say, we are the states, we have built-in powers, and one of them is Article 5, the ability to come to the federal government and say, we will have a convention and we will decide as states what the right answers are to actually change our Constitution if needed, and whatever we come up with has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states to actually make them official. I think that's a reasonable ask from the states of the federal government because they exist for us, not the other way around.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second part of my question, I feel like you all touched on it earlier, but I do want to ask it again. How do you think this resolution would impact existing federal mandates and regulations that Ohio currently follows?
Thank you, Representative Humphrey, through the chair. I think that's fairly broad. A convention would have the authority to talk about a lot of, what the federal government does, and if that's sort of necessary to dictate, doesn't mean it doesn't need to happen in Ohio, but Ohio maybe should decide how that happens in Ohio. I think there's a whole host of federal programs and things that they're talking about now at the federal government, but in addition to that, I think there's just a lot of other things that, that the federal government over the years has increased programs, has attached dollars to, and then as we're frankly, going through the state budget, currently trying to decide how we're going to spend Ohio dollars. There's so many times we come to a kind of a fork in the road and say, oh wait, can we do that? We can't do that. There's a federal requirement saying that we can't do that, or we have to apply for a waiver from federal requirements. There's so much of what state policy, our hands are tied. I'm sure many of you with legislation have come to an idea, and you come to a kind of a fork in the road and say, some policy expert comes and says, well, you can't do that. There's a federal restriction on that. Well, you can't do that. There's a federal restriction on that.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Representative Sims.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony today. Just level setting, I guess you would say, in this environment. Even as we talk about Article 5, there's a great intrepidation amongst the people about the current executive branch and, how wildly it has roamed. So back to Article 5, is there any provision, say, if the executive decides to hijack the convention, and the three areas that you've identified are broadened? Is there any recourse for the people to keep that from happening? Or what happens if and when that happens?
I think, if I get your question correctly, the executive branch is fully outside this process, just to be clear. And I would say, again, this is in my opinion, because of my experience over my lifetime, this has been, to me, one of the least partisan things ever proposed as a large movement, constitutional change. And the reason I say that is because the last time that it was held on a large scale and we had a large number of states, we also had Republican majorities. And I think it's telling whenever that majority is asking for those foundational changes against the government that they're controlling at the time. That I think that makes a statement about what we believe as states, not necessarily for the federal government, because again I say the federal government exists for our purpose, not for their own. And we should be giving them the power to do those things and not relinquishing our power as a state. And so there's no provision in there that allows any executive influence into this. It is owned, and the reason why we say Convention of States, be clear, it's a constitutional convention that we're calling. We're calling Convention of States is because that's where the power lives. The states have the power to do this. The states have the power to make these changes. It is, irregardless of what administration, what type of administration it is about reining in the actual, in controlling the federal government using the power given under the U.S. Constitution.
Well, Phillips, and with all due respect, I appreciate in theory what you just said, but I still think we're living in a different reality today. I did have a question, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, regarding term limits. I know there's been great discussion. I think for us, we've always seen, the challenges of term limits. Is there any provisions? Currently, what we see is someone going from house to house. It almost negates the whole idea of term limits. Any thoughts on how we address that?
Thank you, Representative Sims, through the chair. As kind of we previously talked about, I think that this is sort of agnostic to what the actual plans would be. There are proposals out there to say, kind of a lifetime cap, so number of years regardless of chamber, that's how many years you get and you can't exceed that. So I think, those ideas are out there and open for discussion, and this is not prescribing the plan. This is prescribing the kind of date and time and what the subject matter details that we are going to discuss are. The convention ultimately would decide that.
Thank you, Representative Sims. Representative Troy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your sponsored testimony. there's probably a reason why this methodology has not been used in 248 years. And I think the beauty of our current Constitution is that it's only been amended 27 times, and the first 10 came right out of the chute with the Bill of Rights. 2 other amendments, one created prohibition, the other one repealed it. So it's a lot of constitutional experts, and I think this has been mentioned here before, feel that you cannot limit what's going to happen in a convention that's called like this, because all it takes is, as we can see sometimes on the floor, we just waive the rules so that we can proceed doing something else. So, but the concern I have is that the wisdom of the Founding Fathers was these 3 independent, equal branches of government. And we're seeing some of the debate that's taking place in our nation's capital. A lot of that debate agreed to by the majority party. I mean, wouldn't your concern be that if we get a convention like this, that our checks and balance system of 3 equal branches of government may in fact be in jeopardy?
Thank you, Representative Troy, through the chair. No, I don't think anywhere in this parameters are we asking for that to be changed. The Constitution, to kind of your point of why has this never been happened, I would think that if our founders were among us today, they would probably be shocked that we haven't used this provision to some regard. To say that if Congress refuses to address sort of the demands of many states, and these topics are issues that are felt not only in Ohio but across this nation, that you haven't used the mechanism that they've given us to address the issue and have the conversation, I think they would be surprised at that fact. And there are, to the point of legal experts on both sides of this issue, with the details that we've outlined earlier, and I'm sure we would, with the will of the chair, we would love to have all sides in here to debate this. But the fact of the matter is there's risk involved in both sides. There's risk in action. There's certainly risk in inaction. And the trajectory of this nation and the sort of instability of our federal government over the course of the last, 249 years, but probably more recently than the last 50 years, has put us on a trajectory that is hugely concerning to me, and that's why I'm before you today. That's why I've been before this body for the last 2 General Assemblies, is because we must to course correct. And frankly, I am pleased with some of the efficiency measures that are going on in the federal government. But I also am concerned with the lasting nature of any of the actions that they're able to take to put us back on a path of sustainability.
Paul? Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned here that you want to define or limit the purpose of this to term limits, to reining in federal spending. Elections are elections. I mean, if the good people of Iowa want to send Senator Grassley back to the Senate, that's their choice to do that. Or if the good people of South Carolina, sent Strom Thurmond there until he was about 100 years old, that's their prerogative. That's democracy. But you mentioned, the balanced budget and reining in spending. I mean, and certainly that's an issue. But I also point out that, we may never have gotten out of the Great Depression in the 30s if it wasn't for deficit spending. We might not have been on the winning side of World War II if it wasn't for a deficit. So there are times when, in emergencies where that is necessary, I guess, the real concern here is that what will happen to some of these programs, like Medicare, like Social Security, if as a result of this convention, there's a balance, especially when there is a great appetite by the folks in Washington right now to further cut the revenue through tax cuts. I just see, a potential disaster from something like this.
Through the chair to the representative, and thank you again for what I think are well thought out arguments. realizing that, and I'll go back to my joint sponsor's statement. I actually differ with his thought that I'm not sure that the founders, I have no direct knowledge. I'm not sure that the founders put Article 5 in there expecting that there would ever be a convention. And I will say again, in my lifetime, the last time that we were very close and had enough states that could have called a convention, our Congress acted and we had a balanced budget. And we actually were moving in the correct direction, going through the mid to late 80s into the early 90s. And those things are the result, truly, I believe, those are the result of Congress going, if we do not act, the states will act. And they might not like the outcome of that. And so I say again, I'm agnostic to whether we have a convention. I'm very, very adamant that we need to call for a convention and move in that direction, knowing that that is a long process. And I will reiterate my previous statement. Even at the end of that long process, assuming that we do come out with something that says balanced budget amendment that has potentially, and I don't think anyone would be looking in that convention and saying, well, we're just going to say we're balancing budget. Next year, it's all going to be balanced, and we're going to wipe the slate clean, right? We know that our legislators have the common sense to go, there's a process we're going to have to go through to get to this point, and we'll work our way through that process to get to that. Again, whether we get there or not, who knows? Again, whatever they come up with, assuming that all of these things happen, and we have a convention, and they say we're going to have a balanced budget, and they lay out all the process for that, I say again, 75% of the states have to ratify it before it comes into effect. Otherwise, we just start over. In the interim, and I'll just say again, even if we got to the end of that and only 60% of the states ratified it, we will have had a federal government who is on notice that the states have said, if you do not rein yourself in, we will rein you in. And I am just stating from history, historically, the federal government reins themselves in as this process moves forward.
Thank you, Representative Troy. Representative Claggett.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate your testimony today. A couple things that I want to expand on just a little bit. So I'll give you both questions and you can hit them in whatever order you wish. In regard to the specific items that would be set forward for a convention, you listed 3. Assuming that there is a balanced budget amendment as part of that, you would have to then, I assume, have a provision for a War Powers Act in regard to, declaration of war and deficit spending and so forth. So there is a considerable debate in Congress currently, and has been in my lifetime in regard to how War Powers Act should be even called. And there's a power dynamic there that's not been fully resolved. So I'm curious, from the perspective of this particular issue, do you have a comment on how that issue could be resolved? Because there's multiple strings attached to a war powers between a president and a Congress acting as one. Okay, so that's a really big issue, and because you could abuse that is the point. All right, so that's one thing. The second thing is there any sense in which if you the state specifically call it for the 3 issues, that you could employ the jurisdiction of, say, the United States Supreme Court or some other body to validate or invalidate a runaway convention? So is there any way to use the third branch of government to satisfy the concerns of folks that says this thing could get out of control in a hurry? So that's the 2 issues I'm concerned about.
Well, I would say to your first question with the War Powers Act, I don't think there's ever going to be a time where we are going to have to be able to tell the federal government, this is the pure answer and that's it. And I think leaving the conversation that Representative Troy brought up, that there are things that our government has had to do in the past that has been deficit spending, right? Those things are outside of the budget process. And there's a very big difference in having a budget that says we are going to actually be able to pay for the things that we are using and doing versus we've had an emergency. And I don't think there will ever not be an emergency clause in there. There will never, I don't believe there will ever not be a War Powers Act available for the purposes of other things that are going to happen, right? Those are the contingencies and things that we have to be able to do. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of your question.
Go ahead.
Chairman, it is, well, okay, so that's not fully the issue, because yes, that's right, we're always going to emergency. The concern would be under a war powers declaration that Congress would make in the idea that would spend a lot of money. You could take the entire $1 trillion budget of the United States military under a Declaration of War Act and say that's all emergency at that point. And then you then have this condition where you have social spending that makes up this significant piece. So that's considered a concern. So that's what I'm concerned about. The issue is under regard to the Supreme Court or some other body that has jurisdiction over a runaway convention. Is there any sense in which something could be the mediator of that particular issue in a convention of states?
Through the chair and to the Representative Claggett, very important questions, and so to your first question, I'll just kind of put a cap on that. I think those considerations, would have to be addressed when you're talking about a balanced budget. Anytime I think that there is a place for emergency powers and ways for certain situations, but the guidelines and restrictions have to be addressed, so those cannot be abused, as we've seen here, over the last 5 years. And with regards to sort of oversight on this whole process, I could make an attempt to answer that. I've heard legal opinions on it, but with respect to the chair, I would probably defer to some expert, legal minds that we could get in on the proponent and opponent days to give you their arguments. Because again, within the legal community, as you can imagine, there are differing opinions.
Thank you, Representative Claggett. Last question goes to Representative Gross. You've had 4 questions today. Everybody else has had 2. So.
Thank you, Chair. Gentlemen, you had said, I believe, in your earlier testimony that states had not been consistent in all their requests. They have multiple different convention calls for conventions. One of those actually is Governor Newsom out of California that would like to abolish the Second Amendment. Where does it say in the Article 5 or the Constitution anywhere that you can limit the convention to what you have decided you want the convention to be? And then I do have a follow-up.
Thank you. Through the chair, through Rep. Gross. So as you know, the actual text in Article 5 is very limited, right? So which leaves it up to legal interpretation, which is why we have these legal debates today. We are specifically calling for the specific purposes that we've outlined before you today. Those 3 purposes, which doesn't touch the Second Amendment, and I'm in full support of you that we should not. And you'll see in our next, where we go through specifically what we tell the Ohio delegation is in bounds or out of bounds. And so we have accounted for that. There are legal, like I said, precedents, and we're going to provide that to the committee for all the conventions. Our founders at the time, a convention was a regular occurrence. Like they had conventions throughout the formation of this nation, which led to the formation of this nation in many regards, and they've happened since. So I think that there certainly is parameters. There are many differing opinions, whether that be across the board, simple, balanced budget to what you're talking about, repealing Second Amendment, which Ohio should never support. We've got campaign finance. There's a whole host of things out there. With regards to our specific call, there are 19 states who have issued subject matter similar or exact parameters for the call. So what we are trying to do is to not add our name to the plethora of various calls that are out there. We are trying to become the 20th state in the call for these 3 subject matters. That is the legal argument that we are taking and that we are proposing to this body. Now, we can debate that in committee, and I hope that we will, but that is what we are bringing to you today. And so there are, like we said, 34 states have to make the call. We're at 20. There are quite a few states that have, like Ohio, are somewhere in the process on this debate and are likely to pass it this General Assembly. We'll see if that happens. I hope Ohio is one of them. So that's kind of the groundwork where we're at. This call, there's 19 states. We're asking Ohio to become the 20th.
Last one.
Okay, and just to follow up, thank you, Chair. I think it was in relation to Rep. Sims as well. One of those is a balanced budget. And I am not speaking whether I agree or disagree, but we are about ready in Ohio to draw down more federal monies in the hospital franchise fee, the Medicaid match, because every time we draw down money, we get 90% or 65% of every dollar we draw down. Now, every time we draw down amount of money, we expand the size of the federal government. I would like to know how you can justify the size of the federal government growing. Go to the federal government and say, naughty federal government, you are growing large. When we, as a legislature, all of us here in this room, have our hands out to the federal government, and we are expecting almost 30% of the Ohio budget, which will be $108 billion to $110 billion, will be federal match.
Thank you, Representative Gross, to the chair, and I agree wholeheartedly with you. There are a multitude of factors that have led us to where we're at today. Many decisions made at the state level, many programs initiated at the federal level, but we have to go to the source. This goes to the source, and as chair of Medicaid, you are very familiar with all of those things that we have agreed to with the federal government that have infiltrated the Ohio budget, have restricted what we're able to do, and also have grown the federal government. And this is a mechanism that we can address that.
Thank you, members of the committee. That concludes first hearing on House Joint Resolution 2. Now bring forth House Bill 67. Do you want to kind of share the difference at a high level and kind of go from there?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you for the great questions. I think this is thoughtful debate. It needs to happen. This is, and I guess I can kind of go through exactly what this is, but just kind of a high-level summary of what this is. This is a result. We initially just put forward the resolution. We had some concerns from members and from outside parties on the, how do you actually know, you're going to appoint Representative Hall from Ohio to go be the delegate. How do you know that Chairman Hall is going to do the will of the legislature? I don't want to pick on you. I know you would. No doubt.
I would appoint DJ Burns, the rooster, as we have a special guest in committee today.
I object.
The rooster. So
I object to that. Okay.
Sorry about that.
So this, whoever that delegate is, we as the Ohio legislature want to give them effectively marching orders, and then hold them accountable to those marching orders when they are at a convention. And so I'll just briefly kind of run through what we specify in this bill. It addresses those concerns. It creates state statute procedures and penalties for delegates while fulfilling their duty on behalf of Ohio at Constitution. So this defines the number of delegates sent to a convention. We define it as an odd number. We want to make sure we come to that. We want to make sure that we set aside a specific selection procedure. We want specific eligibility requirements. We want a recall procedure, so if you're at the convention, we think you're out of order, we want to be able to pull you back. We want to require them to take an oath of the delegate position. This does allow them to receive compensation for their time in attending the convention. This spells out the delegate roles at a convention. It creates an advisory committee here at the state level. So once we create and have assigned the delegate, we want to have legislators that have specific focus on what they're doing in addition to the large body. You can imagine if a convention is called in 2025, it is going to be on every news channel, live streamed, on social media. I mean, it will be the focus of the nation. Like, the nation would be tuned into, they're not going to be going to a secret room having these debates. I mean, this would be what every person in America is watching. But we're also, creating an advisory committee to keep closer track on that. This sets aside specific limitations and ultimately creates a criminal penalty for a delegate if they violate their oath. So here's where we go into kind of the provisions that are already in this bill of what we're saying the delegates cannot consider. We're saying that any delegate of Ohio cannot make any changes or alterations to the Bill of Rights. So those amendments, we're saying the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th amendments specifically are off the table for discussion. And they will also not be able to vote on things outside the scope of whatever the convention was called for. So again, another mechanism. We're talking belts, suspenders. We want to put every protection on this thing that we can. ensuring what many of our founding fathers, as well as great public servants before, have carefully crafted into our Constitution for protection. So this is what we call a faithful delegate legislation to make sure we have everything in place to make sure that the will of Ohio is portrayed at a convention.
Thank you, Chairman, for giving us additional time on House Bill 67 today. I'll be brief. You've heard most of what is going on with House Joint Resolution 2. Hopefully, we're getting to a little bit of understanding there. I expect that there will be substantial additional testimony over the next few months on this. But what I am wanting to make sure that you understand is this whole idea of having delegates to the convention is a concerning process. We had that concern raised. I know that my joint sponsor has had that raised over the last two General Assemblies. It was certainly a loud call in the last General Assembly. And so this legislation aims to bring all of those concerns, I think, into one place where we can agree that if we are going to appoint an advisory committee that would then tell us, based on criteria, these are the actual delegates that we want to send to a convention, that we need to have some control over that. The way we would do that is setting up the commission that's made up of members from the Senate, that is appointed by the President of the Senate, a member of the House of Representatives appointed by the Speaker, a member of the General Assembly nominated by joint action of the President of the Senate and the Speaker, and approved by the majority of those voting in each chamber. As an addition to that, we want to make sure that there are specific guidelines on those unauthorized delegate actions. You heard a listing of what some of those are already. Just realizing that any of those persons who would be voting for or otherwise promoting any change to the traditional conventional rule of decision on the floor and in the committee of the whole, including that each state has one vote, or voting in favor of any proposed amendment that is outside the scope of the subject matter as limited by the General Assembly's original application to Congress for a convention of states, which would be your resolution, House Joint Resolution 2. These being violated, the delegate would be guilty of a felony of the third degree. This rule will be established to ensure the purpose of the convention is never changed from its initial call, preventing what those have called a runaway convention. I want to thank both Representative McLean and you all for hearing both of these today. I'm ready to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you both for hanging around today and spending some time with us. Representative Gross.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. I understand that if HB 67 is passed, that would be Ohio law. But I'd like to know what specific legal authority that you can cite that would hold a delegate to the instructions that are given, because we only have one, perhaps, and or three. What legal authority do you have to, and what can you cite that states that they would be required to stay at the rules that are sent by our delegate or for our delegate to a convention? Does that make sense?
Thank you, Representative Gross, to the chair. That's what we're putting in code today. So we are, there's nothing that exists today. We are creating Ohio revised code that is setting up the parameters, setting up the specifics on selection, on oversight, and on recourse, on recall. So we're setting the parameters in Ohio code that we could, the executive branch would enact. If they're not abiding to what they're doing at a convention, we would have the authority to recall them and go get them from the convention if need be. And then with regards, we're actually, like we said, there are a third degree felony provision to this action in and above what the parameters we've already laid out.
Follow up?
Paul, yep.
I just wanted to ask you, are you aware that under Madison, back in our founding fathers' days, that the notes from the convention in 1787, it was stated that the delegates did not need to ask the states for permission to draft a new constitution?
Through the chair, we are telling Ohio's delegate otherwise in this cause, and we are. There is, and again, we'll get into the legal side, hopefully proponent-opponent. When we get some law experts in here, we are calling for the purposes of a amending convention. We want to be clear on the legal, the way that we word this, because it is important on what, constitutional convention you're calling, because there are legal opinions on that. We want to, and the goal is to make sure that through this process that Ohio provide the legal authority to do what we are communicating to you here today.
Thank you. So just as a follow-up to that, so our delegate would be limited, but if all other 49 delegates are not, then only our delegate would be limited then, correct? Because we don't get to determine law for the other 49 states.
Through the chair, so we don't get to determine their action. The parameters of the convention would control what the subject matter. We can't tell Indiana, Kentucky, California, what they're instructing their delegate to do. That's federalism. They get to do that. Now the actual parameters at a convention, what the subject matter. I mean, any entity, any body that comes together, there are parameters. There's precedent. There's rules of order, subject to the reason that the authority that they've been given. And so, again, we will get through all of that today. We'll leave up other states the way they want to handle their delegate selection, But this is what we're suggesting Ohio do.
Thank you, Representative Gross. Representative Rader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So why does this bill give nearly unilateral power of appointment to the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, as you mentioned, and a jointly appointed third person to form this advisory committee without any mechanism to include the minority party or to include any input from the public?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. And we can debate what this selection would be. This is our proposal. The legislature as a body, so whoever's in the majority of both chambers, that constitutes the will, the measure of what the legislature is. So the legislature has to come to a conclusion on what the parameters are. We are saying whoever is in charge, whoever's the majority on each chamber is going to be at the seat of the table to appoint this position.
Thank you. No follow-up.
Representative Troy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen. A follow-up on that, because you've mentioned that the General Assembly will pick who the delegates are. Of the 19 states, and I know, Representative Will, you had mentioned earlier that this is a bipartisan measure. Of the 19 states that have passed this so far, 17 of those 19 have a super or very comfortable Republican majority. I mean, I'm just wondering, how this will be representative of the country in terms of the decisions made when the process is really the conception of the delegates is basically controlled by one party in this case.
Thank you. Through the chair, Representative Troy, that's a great question. I think, so when you look at when this is passed, I mean, are you looking at sort of partisan makeup today? Because most of these measures have been passed over the course of the last 10 years, which some of that has fluctuated a bit at times. I do understand the concern on sort of partisanship in this process, and I would argue, and I've argued this entire time, the nature of this convention, the actual procedure of calling the convention and going through with this, it inherently, to get anything accomplished, you can't have a partisan process. It can't be a totally partisan issue that's going to get through. To get 38 states to agree on, I think to agree on anything is going to be a Herculean effort. But the partisan demographics of this nation are not that 38 states have a majority. And so this process is going to have to be statesmen and stateswomen to stand up and really holistically address the issues with this nation that we all feel on a daily basis, to make sure our federal government hears the will of the states, responds to the will of the states, and if they don't, we'll go through the ratification process. But it's not going to be a partisan, you're not going to get anything partisan through the ratification process.
Yeah, sure. Just one follow-up. In your testimony, Representative McLean, you indicated which constitutional amendments, including the Bill of Rights, would be off limits for this convention. I notice you did not list the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms. Any reason why that was not a prohibition?
Through the chair, through not intentionally. If you'd like to offer that amendment, I would certainly entertain it.
Thank you, Representative Troy. Representative Sims.
I think most of the questions were around the same thing, but I did have a question about what happens if the people of Ohio don't agree with the delegates? Is there any recourse, since we don't have any minority representation, it would look like, just based on who will be making the appointments?
I think that is basically, well, through the chair to Representative Sims. I believe we're talking about the process by which our constituents decide who's representing them here. But I don't think it's outside the pale to ask that that commission also be representative with a minority member, right? And I think that's an amendment that would be reasonable to ask for also. The last thing that I would say again is, when we look at this as a partisan issue, it's the reason why I say personally, and my feeling on this is that it's an American issue. It is about states' rights, and the fact that we have 17 of the 19 that happen to have majorities in one side right now really is not relevant to the fact that you still have to have 34 states to actually come forward asking for the same things before there's even a call for a convention. And then again, I say, post-convention, with the amendments that are approved by that entire body, which will be from every state, certainly not from just one party in that case. 75% of them, 38 of those states, have to agree to the ratification of any amendment that goes into the Constitution at that point. I think, again, these are pretty high bars to get over to make sure that we are actually doing what the American people want us to do at this point.
Follow-up?
Yeah, and I would say too, with all due respect, and I appreciate your emphasis, we're not really living, to me, in really normal times. And so, these things that are supposed to be aren't necessarily how things are. So I'll just say that. And thank you for your response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Sims. Representative Lear.
Thank you again, Chair Hall. So just a follow-up to the idea of the faithful delegate and only Ohio is going to be held to this. I presume that some of this language came from someplace else, unless we came up with it here, and we don't usually invent the wheel. So could you speak to any other states who have already passed something similar to this or are considering it right now?
Thank you, Representative Lear, through the chair. Absolutely. I don't have that list off the top of my head. I probably should have brought it with me, but we will absolutely get that to you. There are other states who have enacted this and many more who are considering very similar legislation, because obviously the concern everywhere is the same. Is the person that we are going to send or the group that we're going to send going to represent the values that we want them to? And so I will absolutely provide the committee through the chair with the full list of that.
Okay. Thank you so much for, is there any other questions real quick? Seeing no other questions, thank you both for your time today.
Welcome back. You've been watching a previously unaired recording of a hearing in the Ohio House Government Oversight Committee, and they were considering our Article 5 application, HJR 2. Rita, let's start with our introducers. So the two sponsors, they gave an introduction to the resolution. How would you rate their opening statements?
Wow, Andrew, I give them both an A+. They did a great job. Representative McLean, who, as we mentioned, is also the majority whip in Ohio, so it's great to have him as one of our primary sponsors on the House side. He talked about the fact that amending the Constitution is a hard process, intentionally so, and tried to persuade the committee members that it's something we need to be doing now. He just really outlined the process and how it works, the, high bar for ratification, just went through all of that. And he talked about federalism and how this is a tool to, really reestablish, reassert federalism as the way our government works. So I thought that was really good, really important. Then Representative Willis, our other primary sponsor on the House side, also spoke, and he talked about the fact that the Article 5 convention process lets states take the initiative in proposing amendments when Congress won't get the job done and won't act to propose the amendments that the American people really need. And he also reminded or informed the committee members that the whole purpose for the convention process in Article 5 is to let the states rein in the feds. I thought they both did a stellar job, Andrew.
Yeah, I have to agree 100% with you. And, I just really thought it was refreshing to see Representative McLean. And I got to meet him when we were at the simulation back in Colonial Williamsburg. And he's just such an awesome guy, so down to earth. And really, a lot of the time I was just talking to him about, my kids, his kids. So he was just really relatable. And I just thought he gave an awesome job as well. Very, very clear, very direct on needing this now, and how this is a high bar and it's very difficult, but it is worth doing. And something that I saw throughout the hearing was they kept coming back to ratification being a safety measure, in a way that, if something bad were to happen, it takes 38 states to ratify anything that comes out of convention. And so I love how they tied the opening back to, some of the points in the hearing. So really good. I loved both. Rita, what's your any favorite quotes that stuck out to you? Anything that you saw that you really just were like, wow, that was awesome?
Yeah, I can't say that I had any particular quotes, but I would just say in general, I liked how our sponsors kind of took turns answering the questions. It really showed that they both are very informed and educated about this Article 5 convention process. I thought that was a great way for them to handle it. And I just, again, want to give them a high mark for the way they dealt with the questions. They really showed that they know a lot about this. There were a couple of times when they said, we will have constitutional experts coming in to give expert testimony who can give you further and more specific, detailed answers to some of your questions. But as I recall, they gave some sort of an answer to all of the questions, and I thought they did a great job.
Yep. That kind of brings me to one of the representatives who was asking questions to our sponsors. Representative Gross just seemed to get very hung up on not getting the answer that she wanted about, can you guarantee that this is not going to run away? Can you guarantee that they won't talk about other things instead of the subject matter within our application, our call? And I just loved how he kept, like you were saying, bringing it back to, we'll give you all of the precedents, all of the history of interstate conventions that have happened throughout American history. And Representative McLean talked about how we have a rich history of conventions throughout the founding and before, but she just kept getting hung up on, well, you need to tell me right now, give me guarantees that it's not going to run away, or that there's no precedent for it running away. I just thought that was really interesting how she kept kind of hanging her hat on that.
Yeah. And Andrew, if you would indulge me for a minute, I want to take just a moment to talk about that whole line of questioning. And I'm doing the air quotes because I don't know about you, but I got the impression that Representative Gross was definitely opposed to this process, at least as it stands now. Everyone can change their mind, and I'm going to hold out hope that she will, as she gets more and more information and gets educated about the process. But there were a few times when she threw out questions that it was clear that she thought were kind of gotcha moments. And one of those, I think, is what you're talking about. And her question was, where does it say in the Constitution that you can limit the scope of the convention? And first of all, you don't have to have the exact words in the Constitution that define every aspect of the convention process in order to know that. I mean, think about their words like habeas corpus, trial by jury. That's not all defined and spelled out in the Constitution, but we know what those things are by history. And the same is true for an interstate convention. But I just want to respond now for viewers who may have been watching and think, well, how do we know that we can limit the convention? And I really have 4 responses, and I'll be brief. But first, the power to limit the scope of the convention is really inherent in the state's power to apply for the convention in the first place. It wouldn't make any sense for the Constitution to give the states the power to hold a convention once 34 of them apply and then say, but you can't frame the scope of the convention. That it wouldn't make any sense. It's an inherent power. So second is historic precedent that we know of, interstate conventions throughout American history. And for every one of those interstate conventions, the topic is always defined. And by the way, there's never been a runaway convention in history. There's never been an interstate convention that did something other than what the states defined for them to do. Third, just looking at modern or contemporary history, over 400 applications for an Article 5 convention are currently pending or have been filed. The reason we've never had a convention yet is because we've never had 34 of them on the same topic. So if the topic for the convention matters in the application process, if you don't get a convention unless 34 states agree on the topic, then the topic still matters once they're at the convention. That is what defines the power and authority of the convention. Mm-hmm. And then finally, the delegates or commissioners to the convention act as agents of the state legislatures. The state legislatures are the ones who choose their commissioners or delegates and send them there with a limited authority and instructions for what they can do. So that's how we know, Andrew, that yes, the convention can be limited. By the way, there's a great case out there that I hope someone will get to Representative Gross. It's Chiafalo versus Washington. And in that case, the Supreme Court really affirms the authority and power of the states to set limits on the actions of their agents when their agents are sent to perform a federal function.
And Representative McClain, I think he brought up several times about the fact that 34 Ready or our delegate selection bill would address a lot of these issues, because then Ohio would set the parameters. They would set what the commissioners are going there to do, what they can and cannot talk about, and that kind of adds an extra layer of protection that really I don't think that Representative Gross can just overcome that. Yeah. So, and like you said, I think it just was all gotcha questions because she's not in favor of using Article 5 for whatever her reasons might be. But yeah, I hold out hope too, because there are several champions that we have today that didn't start out as champions. They started out as opponents, and they learned about the process. They learned about Article 5, its history, and then they became diehard champions for us. So yeah. I hold out hope with you.
And frankly, Andrew, the fact that we had such an in-depth Q&A time during this first hearing will really work to the advantage of our team and our experts, because when they go for the proponent testimony, they really know exactly the kinds of things they need to address in advance. So I thought it was actually a really great hearing.
So speaking of that, actually we could segue really nicely into the next part of this is, where's Ohio in the process right now?
Yeah, well, again, we have companion bills going on the House side and the Senate side. The Senate is a little further along. So the next step on the Senate side will be the third hearing, which is when the opponents get to come out and have their day in the hearing room. And Andrew, I hope we can be together and do COS live for that, because that's going to be a fun day if we can stomach all of the opponents.
I was going to say I might be calling out sick that day. I'm not sick yet, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to be calling out sick that day. So no, I'm kidding. I wouldn't leave you hanging like that, Rita.
Yeah, don't leave me, brother. Okay, so that's the third hearing. And then typically they do a final fourth hearing that's interested parties. before the committee actually votes. Although it is possible for them to combine those last two. So we're waiting now with bated breath for them to schedule that fourth hearing on the Senate side. Once they schedule it, we'll know exactly who all will be included in that hearing and, what kinds of testimony they will allow. But it will definitely at least include the opponents. So that'll be exciting. And then on the House side, the next hearing they schedule in the committee will be for proponents. Most likely it'll be just proponents. So that'll be a good and exciting day to get inspired for COS.
Mm-hmm. And real quick, Rita, are we up against the clock? When does the Ohio legislature, when does the session end?
We really have plenty of time. Technically, they're in session through the end of the year. Of course, they'll have breaks, especially over the summer. They'll have a pretty long summer break, but we've got plenty of time yet this year. So no, we're not up against the clock. Things are looking good so far in Ohio, and I'm excited to see what's going to happen the rest of this year there.
I am really excited to see what happens as well. And we'll have to come back for the next hearing, whether it's opponent or not. We'll come back. We'll offer some we'll offer some commentary on whatever we see. But before we leave today, Rita, what's a call to action that we could, send out to our grassroots who are watching this right now, particularly those who live in Ohio? What's our call to action?
Yeah, go to conventionofstates.com, sign the petition, get plugged in with that Ohio team. They are one of the strongest grassroots teams in the nation. As you know, Andrew, they're extremely organized and they would love to have more help. So sign that petition, get involved with the Ohio team. They will put you right to work, and everybody has something to offer in this.
All right. Well, Rita, we'll just have to leave it there. Great being with you today again. And we'll be back together on the next COS Live when we're covering hopefully Ohio or some other state. So until then, Rita, we got a country to save. So it's time for us to get back to work.